The following program does not necessarily represent the views and opinions of Reality Radio 101, its advertisers and sponsors, or its listening audience. Listener discretion is advised. Good evening and good morning and good afternoon wherever you may be. Welcome to the Bear Psychology Radio Show with psychologist, author, and speaker, Dr. Anna Baranowski, where mind, mood, and what matters to you are discussed. We're broadcasting live from Toronto, Ontario, Canada on Reality Radio 101. Send us an email right now. Our email address is instudio101@gmail.com. And now, right to your host of the Bear Psychology Radio Show, Dr. Anna Baranowski.
Hi, everyone. I'm so glad to be back with you again today. I want to remind you that we're really using this time to focus in on bearing witness to evolving mind, mood, and health. And, you know, I have found that the most profound changes occur when a person truly feels heard and understood. And I like to think of it as deeply bearing witness to life evolving. We can get incredibly stuck when we live with our fears, our stressors, and troubles alone in isolation. But when we share and we dialogue and feel supported, it provides a powerful foundation for us to move forward in understanding and care. And I think this show is a really, really good example of that. As usual, I'm always interested in what you, our listeners, have to say. Make sure that if you have a question or something that you want to raise, or maybe even an experience that you've had, email instudio101@gmail.com, and we will hope to get to that. We are very fortunate today because we have Dr. Amelia Kelley and Kendall and Combs, the authors of What I Wish I Knew, Surviving and Thriving After an Abusive Relationship. This is a really interesting book because it's really a person who has directly experienced abuse in relationship, managed to get out with strength and clarity and courage, and a clinician who focuses on trauma and care for individuals using the body and the mind to provide clarity and direction for people who are trying to make that courageous journey out of a difficult relationship. So we have both Dr. Kelley here and Kendall and Combs to help us understand a little bit about their book, What I Wish I Knew, Surviving and Thriving After an Abusive Relationship, which is easily available. And I hope that if this is something that really resonates with you, you'll pick up a copy. It's very well written and does this really interesting job of looking at, both strategies to deal with a situation like this, and also a very, very personal story. So welcome both of you, and thank you for joining me today.
Hey, thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, it's great to have you both. What I'd really like to do is really get both of you telling me a little bit about what your experience was, what brought you to write this book together. What I really want to start with is your experience, Kendall Ann, because even reading the very first lines in this book, and I'm gonna read a quote you put at the front, which is the fairy tale relationship. The devil doesn't come dressed in a red cape and pointy horns. He comes as everything you've ever wished for. And then you go on, Kendall Ann. I think these are your words. It was years in the making, but this was the moment of truth. I was lying on my back on the cold linoleum floor while a man twice my size suffocated and strangled me, banging my head against the floor beneath me. I fought to breathe. My vision began to blur. Now, you're a survivor, so we're talking with you today, and that must have been an incredibly terrifying moment. But as we read on in the book, you describe this relationship as being really like the best thing you could have ever hoped for at a certain point. So maybe start by helping me to understand how you went from, this terrible end point. We're kind of running backwards to the start of this relationship and what that relationship looked like in the beginning, if this was the end point. Sure, absolutely. So that chapter name of being a fairy tale relationship, it really hits the nail on the head. What my experience was, what many people experience, is that your abuser asks you a lot of questions and gets a lot of information from you, and then shows up as that exact person that you want, that exact person that you need. And you fall in love with them very quickly because in your eyes, they're perfect. What you don't know is that was a strategy, right? So that later on, when they're trying to control you and doing horrible things to you, you blame yourself for the loss of that person that you first fell in love with. But that person never existed, right? Like, that person was just based on, it's like almost like a hallucination based on information that you gave your abuser. So that is so interesting because it sounds like it's almost like you don't have a chance, Kendall Ann. You don't have a chance in a situation like that because you have been mined for all that content until you get to the place where everything that person needs to know to really gain your trust, have you feel safe. You've handed it all over. You're trying probably to be transparent. And in the end, it's like in all that transparency, it's like you've handed over the keys to the kingdom in a way. Yeah. And it was so interesting for me when you were, talking about the objectives of this show. And one of them is for people to feel heard. That's exactly the way you feel in the beginning of an abusive relationship, because your abuser asks you all of these questions and you really feel like, wow, this person is so interested in me. This person cares for me so much. This person wants to know like all of my needs, all my hopes, all my dreams. And you feel so loved and supported. And you don't know what will happen later with that information. So it was interesting for you to say like, oh, for people to be heard, because that's people want to be heard. You are absolutely right. And it sounds delicious. And it makes sense that somebody really skilled at doing exactly that would be in a very, very powerful position. Really, really powerful. So what is the connection between the two of you and Dr. Kelley? What was it like for you to co-author this book with Kendall Ann?
Well, the connection began with Kendall Ann's podcast, actually, High Heels and Heartache. I was a guest on there a number of times. And at the end of an episode, when I was leaving her studio in person, pre-COVID, I asked if she had ever thought of writing about all these awesome things she learns from these experts she has on her podcast. And it was definitely one of those light bulb moments. We realized this is something we absolutely had to do. What I didn't expect was that she was going to be as courageous as she was to share her entire story in such a raw manner. And what it did was lent me this opportunity to witness someone who wasn't coming to me for therapy, but instead was someone who had already gone through her own journey and was already working to thrive and survive. And so it's so unique and interesting to be able to hear her story and to turn it into something that becomes a tool or a vehicle for other people to hopefully not be wooed or lured in by someone who's so manipulative. I think you had said just previously that you just don't stand a chance. And while that is very true in some ways, that is actually our mission, is to help listeners, readers, viewers, if you will, to have a chance, because education, awareness, and getting ahead of the ball, so to speak, can protect you. And that's really what our whole mission and our hope was writing this book.
Yeah, there's a funny thing about that idea. I don't know if this makes sense to you. You write about love bombing, this narcissist or predator weapon, and really, it really seems to me that is exactly what happened to you, Kendall Ann. And I mean, my feeling about how this really happens is that it's often people who have really tender hearts, good kind of open-hearted individuals, men and women, by the way, that is true, who have a kind of a longing for deep connection and, want to have a beautiful relationship, long for it, don't even see it coming, would never read a book like this, wouldn't even listen to the podcast, because it's like, it's not on their radar until you're already, 2 feet in. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, my hope, and I know we both can answer to this. One of the things that I find hopeful, while also as a therapist, I have to kind of safeguard this at times, is that psychology has become a lot more palatable to the masses. There is a lot more of this pop psychology movement, which, as I mentioned, sometimes I have to help relieve the anxiety of my clients to let them know that everything they're reading and hearing is not them. However, I do think that the language is becoming more normalized and readily discussed. Things like love bombing, gaslighting, breadcrumbing, all the ings, that it's becoming a little bit more of a normal conversation. I do attribute some of this to the Me Too movement also. There's more of this conversation that's happening and needs to go so far back as to start with when children learn about consent. I mean, this should be something that is discussed at such a deeper, earlier level. But with regard to whether or not, you can identify these things and have them on your radar, if anyone has deep empathy, if they are sensitive, a lot of times I discuss highly sensitive people in my work. Those individuals are incredibly appealing to narcissists and emotional vampires because they have a lot of the traits that narcissists and abusers are looking for. They're looking for someone who can be compassionate and forgiving and dedicated and loyal and empathetic. And so if anyone who's listening is even just a sensitive person, this is worth listening to and learning about. Even if, as you were mentioning, it's not necessarily on their radar that they would end up in a relationship like this.
Yeah. What are your thoughts, Kendall Ann? Because it seems like, from reading this book, it seems like you were already deep in before, like you write that at the beginning, there was a point where, things shifted from elation and attraction to slight trepidation. So it's like you could still forgive that. You were still on board with that. You were still progressing and moving forward. There were some red flags, but you were also saying, like, no, I can handle this. I mean, it's okay at this point. So what are your thoughts?
One of the things that, as a survivor, I have read about is that a lot of people who are in abusive relationships actually have like chronic health problems. And I really think it's because of the push and pull that's going on inside your heart and your mind and your gut, because you're getting competing information, right? And it's causing cognitive dissonance in you. And you're like, which way is up at this point? And you're constantly trying to make sense of things. And that's going on while you're also being convinced by someone who is highly skilled at manipulation that their behavior is your fault. And that if you would react in better ways, act in better ways, fold laundry the way they like it, whatever it is that they are really hurting you about that day, it's about you. It's not about them. If you would just act correctly, then they could stop whatever they're doing in the abusive relationship.
Yeah.
So that's where that comes from.
I do kind of see how important it is to put a book like this out, because often, even at the early stages when you're having that kind of like, something is really off here, doesn't feel right, this kind of content can be incredibly useful in your podcast and just kind of raising awareness about these issues, and also having people around us who can help us see the red flags. All of those things are really, really helpful. But I still see really smart people ending up in relationships that are very dangerous. And some of them are people who you'd think that they would know. But I just think that there is such a real skill that like your abuser was highly skilled. And I'm always loath to kind of turn that on a person and say, well, you should have known better, because I don't think it's so easy. I don't see that you could have really known better. Even if you read something like this, sometimes it's like, wow, but it's just doesn't see until you're so far in that it's really dangerous. And you talk about how your behavior started to change as a mechanism of survival. Can you talk about that?
Sure. It didn't start as just survival. It started with when you were saying before about like tender-hearted people, that we tend to fall prey to this sort of manipulation, because one example is I love to dance. And when I first met my abuser, I was going to dance class a couple nights a week, and I just loved it. Really, dancing really like sets my soul on fire. I just love it. And my abuser started to tell me that on the nights that I went to dance class, he really missed me. That's the way that the communication in this vein started to happen, right? Oh, I miss you so much when you're at dance class. And then over time, it turned into, you don't really love me because you would rather go to dance class than spend time with me. So, when we're looking for red flags and behaviors, the way that it morphs, when you can, stand at the finish line and look back, you're like, oh, that's how we got here. But when you're in it, it's morphing so slowly, and they're using the tools that they, are masterful at to really get you to do what they want. So you start that way, and then you become, every decision you make, you think, does this rock the boat or does this keep the peace? And that is when every action you ever do, all you think about is just pleasing your abuser. And it's a very difficult way to live. And it's, when you live in fear that everything you think, everything you do is wrong, it's a really horrible way to live.
Wow. As you're talking about that, and I know you address this in the book as well, and I'm going to make a guess that a lot of this may come from the writing of Dr. Kelley, just the concepts around codependency and people pleasing, and how that, it's not like it doesn't make sense to have kind relationships and make concessions when needed, but codependency goes way beyond that, and the kind of people pleasing that goes along with codependency goes way beyond that. Dr. Kelley, can you talk a little bit about your version of how people pleasing and codependency leads to a kind of vulnerability to these kinds of relationships?
Absolutely. And we do explore this because this was part of Kendall Ann's experience, and it is quite common in these relationships. So, to point out how codependency becomes present in a relationship, I think it's important to start with the contradiction to codependency, and that is self individualized emotions. So if you can start out of the gate with emotional individuation, expressing your differences, asserting your needs very early on, the potential abuser is going to be less likely to think that their tactics are going to work. So, this is one preventative measure that I would encourage people to think about. And it can be something as simple as, what do you want to eat for dinner? What movie do you want to go to? Do you agree with the partner about, I was bringing up entertainment. Do you agree with them about what kind of music they like? Even something as simple as that. Do you feel safe enough and free enough to be individual in the way that you feel? This can stem all the way back. I don't want to always point at childhood, but this is one thing that can come from what we learn as a child. Are we able to voice our opinions? Do we have that safe experience to disagree? Is it okay not to be liked? Are people still going to want to be around us and still love us, even if we're not pleasing them? So, to circle this back to what you were saying about people pleasing, there is a very dangerous misconception that people pleasing sustains these loving relationships, because in fact, what it does is creates this really gross difference of power. And this doesn't just have to be romantic relationships. This can be coworkers, this can be friends. And so what I often see happen is almost a pendulum, where if someone is so strongly people pleasing for a period of time, there will be a point where things will snap. And that's one of the things about codependency. I want to be clear. Codependency does not mean you're just deeply connected to someone. That is a misconception many of my clients struggle with. Codependency is when you are putting someone else's wellness in front of your own at the expense of your own. And we want some level of codependency in certain relationships. I should certainly be more codependent with my 2-year-old than my husband. But, you know, when it comes to a partner and someone that you're choosing to spend your life with or spend your love and energy on, there should not be that level of codependency where you feel the only way that you can sustain the relationship is by walking on the eggshells and pleasing them. So, starting from the very beginning of a relationship, reminding mantra work not to have to people please and have your own opinion can be very powerful.
Yeah, and it can surely result in the relationship, the abusive relationship, falling apart earlier on.
I always joke, I am every narcissist nightmare. They
Good for you.
We would be a horrible team, a horrible couple.
Right, because you want to be in a balanced relationship with somebody, not necessarily in a relationship with somebody where, you know, there's this kind of feeling like, if only I could really give you everything you need and want, then I will be peaceful, because I can't stand for you to suffer even a little bit if I say no. And it causes so much trouble. You know, and it seems like, you know, this vulnerability can just open up a gateway to you being the perfect person for somebody who's really thirsty to, you know, take advantage of that kind of warmth and desire for that depth of relationship. It's tricky.
I just want to tell you that I love the word no in relationships. If you can say no, because remember, it's a full sentence. If you can say no, that is a testament to whether it is a balanced and true relationship. So if you fear the word no within the relationship, that's a red flag to look out for.
Well put. Let's read a little bit of the emails that are coming in. This one is from Frank. And Frank says, hello, Dr. Baranowski and guests. Man, did COVID do a take on relationships, more divorces and split ups during the pandemic? Talk about abuse. Yes, I have actually seen a lot of relationships fall apart. Not all of them because of abuse, but I think that when people were locked down in the way they were, the cracks certainly became apparent. What are your thoughts on that, Kendall and Dr. Kelley?
I was very concerned for people who were in an abusive relationship because they were being forced to stay with their abuser 24/7. So that made me very worried. Also, people, as the people being abused, they never got to like take a breath, right? They didn't get to at least go to work or, go to class or anything. They must have felt so stifled, during that time. So as soon as lockdown happened, I was like, oh no, my heart just broke for people because I just imagined the way I would have had to live my life if I would have still been in a relationship with my abuser.
Yeah. Well, your book came out in 2021, so I don't know if COVID had already started at that point when you wrote the book, or if it was just published in 2021.
So we were writing it all throughout the pandemic. It actually began pre-pandemic and then went through the ebbs and flows of the world, being constricted and open and constricted. And so that was actually very apparent in our journey in writing it. A lot changed within our lives as well. And it was ready to launch in 2021, but came out in 2022. So, it's definitely been a journey that was pulled along with, as Frank was saying, all these relationships were being strained. I can say, just from my experience with clients, I saw quite a few relationships that had been already tense leading up to the pandemic, finally going over that finish line of either filing for separation or finalizing divorces or deciding whether they were going to fully invest or not. I did actually see a handful of relationships do better when all the noise was quieted. Now, these were not abusive relationships. But as Kendall Ann was saying, for those who were in an abusive relationship, I remember having a conversation one day with an introvert who said, I could do this lockdown thing. This is fine. And I said, yeah, I can see that. However, for folks who don't have security at home, whether it be relationship security, food security, financial security, the home became just as dangerous and toxic as the world was at that moment. So he brings up a good point. If you look at the statistics, just as suicide attempts had increased and mental health intakes at hospitals increased, so too did divorce.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's been a really, really rough go for a lot of people. And, I found that even with people who identify as being introverted, the casual interactions that a lot of people had were sustaining to some degree. And even introverts, I noticed, started to actually show signs of increased anxiety and depression over time. Maybe not right away, but there were periods of time when things got very intense, and I was seeing, some changes in the introverts in my practice. The people who are really, really happy with their own company most of the time, but we disregard, I think, how important those casual interactions are, and they were just missing entirely for periods of time. I mean, in Toronto, where I'm located in Ontario, Canada, our lockdowns were pretty intense. I mean, I never stopped working. I was in my office the whole time. But I'm an extrovert. So, for me, it's like I was super glad that I had a place to go and I was on the street every day. But I remember early on, no cars around. It was really, really strange. I don't know how severe it was in the areas that you were in.
Well, and I will echo that introversion does not mean you don't need people, and it does
Yes.
not mean that you're not a social being. We are all social beings. It just may mean you have a different cap of how much stimulation and social time you need because you need that downtime to process and, regroup and decompress. So, well, it's funny because we're in two different places now. Kendall Ann and I, we began in the same place, but we're in different areas now. So I can speak to Raleigh, but I don't know how it was where you were exactly.
Yeah, here in Maryland, it was, things got locked down pretty tightly. And then, around here, it's everybody's just kind of whatever they feel comfortable with now, mask or don't mask. It's really, what you feel most comfortable with.
Different landscape at the moment, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
I'm interested in what happens kind of when you are in the depth of it. Before we started the show, Kendall and I were having a slight conversation about, trying to get out of a really tough relationship. And I was saying to her that I have a friend who managed to get out of a very seriously abusive relationship during the pandemic. And, it took a lot of courage. I had incredible admiration for how she navigated it, but it was a tough, tough go. And, I wonder about the level of courage. And, to me, it doesn't matter how much help you get, whether you have a good job, whether you're, have a family that supports you. It still takes enormous courage and kind of a inner grit in a way to make those steps to get out of the difficult relationship. How did you navigate that, Kendall Ann?
Poorly, as we read in the book. If you are thinking about leaving an abusive relationship, make a safety plan. Have a plan in place. Don't just wing it like I did, because it sets you up for a very dangerous situation. So that's always my advice. Make a safety plan. Make sure you tell people you're leaving. Do all of those things, because the number one priority is keeping yourself safe. For me, there's this kind of theory about people who are in abusive relationships and people who are actually in cults, where everything that doesn't make sense to you, or something that strikes you as odd, but isn't like big enough to, leave about it, it's like you take it and you put it on a shelf, right? So what you're doing throughout the relationship is you're just taking all these weird scenarios that are happening, or horrible things that they're saying, and you're just keep putting these things on this shelf, right? And at some point, there is just one more thing, and that shelf breaks. And I gotta go. And that was exactly what happened with me. People in abusive relationships tend to leave. I think, Dr. Kelley's, it takes an average of like 7 times to leave an abuser.
Especially when there's children involved.
Yeah. So, and there were times that my abuser and I broke up, but again, skilled manipulator, they know how to just bring you right back into that relationship. So that's what the thing that made me leave, like, seemed, I'm sure, like, when people read the book, like, well, that's not that bad. But it was that shelf thing. It was that last thing that broke that shelf. And I just refused to live that way anymore.
Yeah. This is an interesting email. This is from Ron. Hi, doctors, longtime listener here. Such an amazing topic today. But don't we use the term abusive relationship way too much when couples aren't getting along and are heading for a split? That's all that we're hearing nowadays. How about not just getting along or not compatible? Those terms seem to fit a lot more than abusive. Well, this is such an interesting perspective, because certainly there are relationships like that. But if we go right back to the very beginning of this book, in which you describe a man twice your size suffocating and strangling you, yep, that would definitely be abuse. So, and there's lots of factors that play into this. So I want to hear your thoughts on this kind of comment. What's the line between, things are just not working out in this relationship. Maybe we're arguing. It's not working out so well, as opposed to this is abusive.
I can definitely speak to that because this occurs quite often when I'm working with folks who come in about relationship problems, where we have to define whether it's abuse or whether it's an unhealthy relationship. So that listener is completely accurate in saying that there are relationships that are just not a good match, where maybe both individual is not bringing their best self to the relationship. And there is validity to working through struggles or issues if it's possible. And there's validity to ending relationships like that because of the fact that it's not a good match. The thing that usually sets the alarm off for me as a trauma-focused therapist, however, is when there is an abuse of power of any kind. So if an individual within the relationship is specifically trying to withhold any sort of power from the other person in an effort to control them, in an effort to form or morph them into what they want at all times, and they're not thinking of the well-being of the other person ever, that is abuse. And do you notice I'm not bringing up physical abuse at all? And this is purposeful. Because with physical abuse, we as a society understandably can identify that. It leads to cuts and bruises. It leads to potential strangulation or death or all these things that we can say black or white, that is abuse. But what needs to be focused on more is the power of emotional abuse and coercion and withholding of love. These things can impact our brains the same exact way physical pain can. Studies have shown this, that the exact area of the brain that fires when it is being physically abused or hurt fires when you're feeling emotionally abused or neglected. So if you feel like you are losing who you are, it is a very good indicator that there is a power play happening where your abuser or the person is trying to gain control over you. So the word control is very important here to define whether it is a bad match, unhealthy relationship, maybe you have some issues to work through, which can feel really stressful and toxic. Or do you feel like your partner is keeping you from having your own empowerment? If that's the case, it is more likely that it is abuse.
That's a really good point. Yeah. And, it's an interesting thing because I think there's also an element of isolation and asking for help in how this all plays out. I think there's something defining in an abusive relationship. Are we being isolated for the people who we would normally seek support from? Or maybe, do we even have that skill set? And you've got a really good template in your book. It's an exercise called Asking for Help. And you ask questions like, when I was younger, who did I reach out to when I needed help and how did they react? The next one is, if I do, in fact, struggle with asking for help, at what age do I recall starting to have a hard time doing so? And what was going on in my life? And what do I think about people who ask for help from me or others? And you know what? I love these 3 questions because they're so self-defining in terms of where we got nourishment or how nourishment was not provided in life. And, I want to encourage the listeners to really contemplate those questions or pick up a copy of the book and, go through some of the exercises because they're really, really interesting. Here's another comment. This is it starts with disagree. This is from Cameron. Hello, I am a clinical family therapist practicing in San Francisco, California. I have to disagree with a lot of what you're discussing. Sure, there are so many folks that are actual abusers, physical, mental, etc. in a relationship, but the norm seems to be in the world now that everyone that does not get along is in a toxic relationship or abusive relationship. Not really true. How about not getting along, get to therapy and see what the problem may be? But abusive, a very strong word that is used way too much in this world. So that's actually very similar to the previous comment. And, I think because we're getting more than one email with a similar theme, I'm wondering about, the disagreement element of this, and, how that is coming about, and why there's this perception that maybe things have gone too far to the other side, this notion of everybody's in a toxic relationship. What are your thoughts, Kendall Ann?
Oh,
Oh.
I'm probably not the right one on this. Because guess what? If you've been, hurt by someone that you were in a relationship with, it changes you. And so, I have the perspective of I can see where they're coming from, but there are a lot of toxic relationships, and abuse is widespread. If someone is calling you names, if they are trying to control you, if they are coercing you into sex, if they are touching you when you don't want to be touched without consent, those are abusive actions. And so I get it that there is a line, but I believe that, from the emails that I get, from the comments that I get, from the people who approach me because I've told my story, I think a lot of times one might think like, oh, we're calling too many things abusive, but you don't know what goes on in every relationship. And so if you are not one of the people in the relationship, you don't really get to say whether it is abusive or whether it is not. And that's what I think about that.
And I would love to.
That actually hurts a bit to hear. Like when I read that, it hurts a bit, because it's like you can feel the sting of the question. Like, really, are you just kind of coming up with something that is just a little bit too far? And it is a bit worrisome. Because we've got like really seriously sophisticated listeners who listen to psychological content and contemplate this material and really kind of try to grapple with these issues. So it is interesting to me, the comments, and also what the perceptions are. I've got another question here, and this is just asking about the book. So I will just read it again so people know what it is. What I Wish I Knew: Surviving and Thriving After an Abusive Relationship. That's by Dr. Amelia Kelley and Kendall and Combs. Dr. Kelley, you wanted to say something.
You're very perceptive. I appreciate that. I actually wanted to thank those emailers. I want to thank them because they're proving the point of why we need to have this conversation. Because anytime we start to discuss something that is uncomfortable and even potentially more widespread than we might want to admit, it will elicit defensiveness. And so it's not surprising to me that what we're saying might be really difficult for some people to hear. And furthermore, if you really listen closely to how we're talking about this, at no point are we universalizing. We're being very specific, and we're saying there are instances that are this situation and instances that are not. So thank you so much for kind of bringing to light that this is a tough topic.
So listen, I've been married for more than 20 years. I have a very loving spouse, but we fight. And sometimes, things don't go well, and we disagree about things,
Right.
Sometimes like he wants to do something and I'm really not interested in that. And it's like, there's nothing abusive about that. I mean, he definitely has his own perspective about things. And, sometimes he gets upset about something, or sometimes I'll get upset about something, or, like we bought ourselves a foldable kayak. It's called an Oru. I am not plugging the kayak, but I just love this. And it's like it's an engineering work of art. I'm telling you, it's really something. So you fold up and you unfold the kayak. However, it takes teamwork. And we have put this kayak together, like we've unfolded it, put it together, and then had to deconstruct it and put it back into like its packable shape. And believe me, that is not an easy thing for two people in a long-term marriage to do together necessarily, right? So I mean, we might kind of get a little snippy, definitely not abuse.
Right.
But still there might be a little bit of that kind of like you're not pushing the box in the right way, or it's like it's got to go this way, it's got to go that way. So yeah, for sure. I mean, there's definitely going to be that in any long-term relationship. There's going to be this stuff where it's like, I think we went offside for a moment there. Can we try that again? That didn't work so well. Or just the notions about, I don't know, some kind of loving perfection, which truly doesn't exist. If anybody's hoping for, some kind of loving perfection, really just don't go there. If you can have some time with your spouse and enjoy some sweetness together, feel that you can share things that are important, fantastic. But there's always going to be these things that you disagree about. Yes. It's just normal. It's the normal stuff of any long-term relationship and friendships too, because sometimes you'll get into, disagreements with people that you're close to who are your friends. And, but it's different than the red flags, the need to walk on eggshells, to like change your behavior to such a degree because you are trying to protect yourself. And because you've learned over a period of time, what are the things you need to do to stay safe in the relationship. And then there's also this whole thing about gaslighting. Let's talk about gaslighting, which I think is an interesting topic. Maybe Dr. Kelley, can you take that one?
Sure. Can I actually just say
one yes, thing? Go for it.
I would be remiss if I didn't say this.
Good.
If you believe that you are in an abusive relationship and you are listening to this show right now, I believe you. A lot of the problem with domestic violence and abuse is because people think that they will not be believed. And I am here to tell you that there is a whole community of us, and we believe you, we support you, we love you, and we will help you. So if you are in an abusive relationship, there is help available.
What's the help, Kendall Ann? Where do you want people to go?
The first great step is to call the National Domestic Violence Hotline. It's called the hotline. Google the hotline. You can also go to the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence. They have a great website that has a ton of different resources. You can go to Dr. Amelia's Facebook page or my pages, and we have lots of different resources. But I just want to, I want to say it to your heart. If you are listening to this and you are in an abusive relationship, we have your back. Absolutely. Don't let people who say that's not abuse or we use abuse too much, don't let that make you fearful for standing in your truth and getting out and being safe and getting healthy, because we are all here to support you. So, absolutely. Sorry, I just had to say that.
No, I love that. I've got that. Thank you so much, Kendall. And I think that's really, really important. I'm so glad you gave those resources. And I'm just going to remind people that, the blog post that we put out has both Kelley and Combs and Dr. Amelia Kelley's contact information and websites, and Amelia Kelley .com is Dr. Kelley's website, and it's got some really great meditations and contact information, details, resources. So, if you want, you can go and check out ameliakelley.com and Kelley and Combs is also has a great website that has resources, and hers is also Kendall and Combs.com. So it's pretty easy to find. Sorry?
We try to make it easy.
You've made it really easy. Yes. So that is really helpful. Here's another email, and I want to read this one. Hello, wow, hello is what it says. Wow, hello. I'm telling you, we have just the most interesting listeners. So I'm always so grateful to the listeners because they're really sophisticated, understand a lot about what is going on in the world, and contribute a ton during the show. So this is from Kim, and Kim says, I'm a psychiatric nurse and have seen so much of what you're talking about. However, a lot of times the patients that are admitted to our facility come in for assessment, and a lot of them state and use terms like toxic, abusive, hateful, etc. when they find out the problem is that a relationship is really about jealousy or dishonesty or irresponsibility. We need to really separate these assessments with reality. Too many people are using these terms in mental health aspects for getting out of relationships. And that is not very accurate. I think what you're telling the world has to be more accurate than just being abuser. Isn't this interesting?
Wow.
I know. So to me, again, because this is very similar to the previous two emails, this does not happen that often. So there is a tone around. So I don't think we could really dismiss this because there must be a tone about some of this. Johnny Depp and Amber Heard. Let's talk about that for a moment. This is a really interesting thing because it's very controversial. There were a lot of really shocking things that came out in court, and it really launched out of the Me Too movement, like right at the same time a lot of this came out. And I think it has changed the climate a little bit in terms of people saying basically we can't just accept that when somebody says I've been abused, that is entirely accurate. And the Me Too for a while made it much easier for people to express their discomfort, their fear, the concerns that they had in a relationship. But I think this Depp Heard court matter changed the climate to a certain degree.
Agreed.
Yeah.
And, I think one of the things with that case was that it shone a light on that abuse can be co-occurring. So it can come from both sides of a relationship. I am absolutely not going to make my assertions about that case.
Yeah, you noticed I didn't either, right?
Yep. And I'm not going to because it is layered. But, there is something to be said for the fact that there can be dual abuse occurring.
Yeah. And it's not all man on woman. It can be women on men as well. And I think that gets underreported and not addressed. I have quite a few men in my practice where one of the main issues that we are working on is some very, very significant abuse by a female spouse to the male, and what it takes, the kind of courage it takes for the man to get out of, or for the man to even admit that this is happening, not only emotional, but physical abuse. Like just to say, oh my God, like I am a victim of domestic violence. My spouse, my female spouse has been physically abusing me.
Well, it is important to note that with the ratios, 1 in 3 women are going to experience some form of abuse, to speak to the widespread of this. Mm-hmm. Whereas when you control for it with being just emotional abuse, it actually becomes equal for men and women. Mm-hmm. So I think that is very important to note that. And, here's the thing. With the small control group that we just received of feedback, I noticed that 2 of them reported that they were clinicians. And I think that it is imperative to understand that not all clinicians, just because they're a clinician, is well versed in this area. And not all of them have a passion of learning about this area. So I encourage you that if you are worrying about whether your relationship is just something you need to improve or whether it is dangerous, find a clinician who has experience in this area and make sure that is who you discuss this with. We can't just say, because you are someone who prescribes medication, you must understand where I'm coming from just because you're educated in this area. It's got to be specified to domestic violence and or trauma or abuse in general.
Mhm. Karen is writing us, and she says, "Good afternoon, ladies. Dr. Kelley has actually been really fair in her explanation of all of this. There are millions of folks that are actually abused and in toxic relationships. Obviously, anything physical is abuse. Anything that is verbally thrown at you consistently, not in a fit of rage, for an argument is also abusive. Men and women should get help with abuse. But I am glad of the fairness of the topic. Most of these incidents are not abuse or toxic. They can have heated arguments several times with no name calling or physical abuse. I'm not saying that that is what happened to Kendall Ann, but things can get out of control really fast with the law, etc. So a little balancing out on that. I want to know, are there other things that we should know from the two of you before we finish? Because we have literally 5 minutes before our live show is over, and you can see how fast the show goes. I want to remind people about the book. It is What I Wish I Knew, Surviving and Thriving After an Abusive Relationship by Dr. Amelia, Kelley and Kendall and Combs. And I'm so delighted that you both came on with us. Why don't we start with you, Dr. Kelley? Any few words that you want our listeners to know?
I would say too, something that we didn't really get to tap too much into today is what to do after. And I will just try to succinctly offer this. Finding out what is important to you, what your interests are, reconnecting with that inner voice is so imperative. And it is not something that can happen overnight for many folks. It's a journey. We are all truly on a journey, let's be honest. As humans, we can experience suffering, and this is one of the unfortunate forms of suffering that some people will go through. Please find community, though. Please find others who support you. And this could be people that used to be in your life that maybe you've disconnected from. It could be others who know the same situation you've gone through. It could be a helping professional, but you deserve to be heard. You deserve to be supported. And finally, I would just say if any of this conversation pertains to someone you also know or love, because you may be listening to this not as a survivor, but as someone who knows someone going through abuse or a helping professional, our hope is that this book can help you too, help you feel like you understand what they're going through. Because as we explore in the book, it's very difficult to share your story because as we've seen today, there can be some judgment of people going through these situations. So I hope that we can offer that safe space for you to be heard.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much, Dr. Kelley. What are your thoughts, Kendall Ann, that you'd like to share with our listeners before we log off?
I would say, if you're listening to this because you're in an abusive relationship and you're hoping to get more information, I just want to tell you how tough and strong you've already proven yourself to be. If you are in one of these relationships and you are just making it day to day, you should be proud of yourself because it's extremely hard to live like that. And the fact that you've survived this far is evidence that when you are ready and when it is safe, you will get out and you are gonna be okay. I promise you. Just do it safely and when you're ready, but you have everything inside of you that you need to survive and thrive. I promise you.
Kendall Ann, I just want to know, when you say okay, what does your okay look like?
Oh, Well, I have a great job. I have a great dog. I have a great boyfriend. I have
A
great
British one?
Yeah. I have great. I have a great family. And I'm happy. I'm joyous. I got my joy back. And that's what it looks like for me now.
What would you say in terms of the trajectory from the day that you finally got out safe, like there was no going back after that day, to the time where all these pieces started to come together? Like, how long was that journey, and what did you have to do to get there?
Well, I learned a very hard lesson that healing is not linear. So that's the first thing that you have to remind yourself, that you're going to have great days and you're going to have days where you backslide. And your timeline is your timeline. And that's all that matters. You don't have to be on anyone else's timeline of healing. You have to do what is right for you.
That's pretty amazing. And, I really appreciate that you kind of recognize that, there are not only stages of leaving, but, you've got to put a lot of things in place. And sometimes you're going to have like really just awful days, and maybe really heart-wrenching and lonely days. And that's part of the journey. And then you can find yourself in a stable, set place with a community that supports you and cares for you. And I just really appreciate what both of you are doing, your topic, your book. And thank you so very much, both of you, for your time today and what you're giving back to the community. Wishing you and all of our listeners a really gentle day. I hope you are all well, and we will sign off, and I will go kayaking, and I hope you all enjoy a beautiful, lovely day, and be well.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Bear Psychology Radio Show with psychologist, author, and speaker, Dr. Anna Baranowski, right here on Reality Radio 101.